intelligence company that helps law enforcement hunt down human traffickers so they can put them in jail where they belong.
Absolutely. But let's take us through the complete journey of how you got there.
Sure. So I started my career in military special operations in the United States Air Force as a para-rescueman. I then transitioned, did a couple of years of private personnel recovery work, primarily for financial institutions. And then when I say private personnel recovery work, what that usually meant was that some very wealthy investment banker went overseas, did something stupid, usually involving alcohol and women. And then I was the guy who had to go get them out of that situation before the financial analysts found out and their stock price went down. Oh. So I did that for a couple of years and then got a very interesting call asking if I would be interested in joining a program at the Central Intelligence Agency. So I did, and it turned out to be a phenomenal career. But in the course of that career, I kept bumping into the human trafficking problem overseas and then in the United States, and decided that it was something I had to do something about.
And that's, on this channel, we started out with stories of true crime prisoners, then we went ex-cops, ex-prison guards, victims of abuse. And you said something very emotional that resonated, that when you look at that problem, it is something you can't turn away from then. You've just got to do something about it. And what led to that moment?
Yeah, so I actually was quoting William Wilberforce, one of your fellow countrymen, who was really the driver for dismantling the white slave trade that was happening to America and the rest of the world. And so he really said, in one of his speeches to Parliament, that once you can't look away, and you can never again say you did not know. And that was really where I was focused. Most of the work that I did at the CIA was counter-narcotics related, counter-terrorism related, and we kept bumping into human trafficking, but there was really nobody to take the intelligence on the human trafficking activity that we were finding and pass that off to somebody. And I'm sure you heard me say it on Valuetainment, and I've said it many, many times. At least here in America, we have a drug enforcement agency. Yet 90% of drugs are legal. Right? I mean, even cocaine is used to numb the retina for eye surgery. So we have an entire government bureaucracy that spends tens of billions of dollars a year fighting what is the illicit sale of legal commodities, right? Through the war on drugs. How's that going? Having personally participated in it, I can tell you it's not going near as well as we would want it to. We have, in the United States, we have the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms are all legal. In fact, firearms are actually constitutionally protected in the United States. And yet we have a massive bureaucracy that spends billions of dollars a year fighting what is the illicit sale of legal commodities. Last time I checked, on almost every country on earth, slavery, which is what we're talking about here, right? Human trafficking is just a very, very polished word for slavery. Slavery is illegal. And yet we don't have a single government bureaucracy here in the United States, or really anywhere else in the world, that is solely focused on the human trafficking, on the slavery problem.
And we're going to get to more of that. Was it your work through the CIA that led you to the bomber who was trafficking kids?
That's yes, one of the stories that got me into this. As far as who I was working for and what I was doing, whether it was the military or the CIA, is really irrelevant. But yes, I was working overseas. I was actually in Afghanistan, and we found a human trafficker who was actually selling children to bomb builders. And the bomb builder was using the children to test their bombs because they wanted to make sure that they wouldn't go off if a child stepped on them, not because they cared about the child, but because they were trying to kill, U.S. and British soldiers. I was actually living on a British military outpost at the time. And when we found this information on a human trafficker, we couldn't, I mean, there's really nobody to give that intelligence to. There's no presidential mandate to report that information. And even if we did, who do we push it to? So think about that. I mean, we're two of the most powerful countries and empires the world has ever seen. Militarily, intelligence, from an intelligence capacity, from a law enforcement capacity, from a technology capacity, from an economic capacity. I mean, by any way you measure it, we're talking about, I mean, the Western world is more powerful now than it's ever been in any point in history. And yet we can kill people with flying robots from 6,000 miles away, but we don't have anybody who's solely focused on the human trafficking problem. So I'm sure some of the boys from Harefield or from some of the former SAS guys or special boat unit guys or something in your country, right? You know, your top level operators. Ask them how many of them have ever done a human trafficking mission. Not going after a drug trafficker who also happened to traffic children, or going after a bomb builder who also happened to traffic children. Ask them how many times they got a mission where their sole purpose was to confront a human trafficker and bring them to justice. And you'll find, I will actually be shocked if you can find even one instance. All I know from my life are, former spies on both sides of the pond. I know the best of the military operators from both sides of the pond. And when I start asking all my friends, have you ever done a human trafficking mission? I couldn't find a single one who said yes. Some of my partners in law enforcement and friends in law enforcement had, but we're talking about such a small number. Imagine if we took all of the resources that we put into the counter-narcotics fight and we put that into the human trafficking fight. Human trafficking would be done. I mean, it would just be done. We put it into the child exploitation fight. It would be done. And I'm not saying that the counter-narcotics fight is not important. I think in many ways it actually is very important because of what it feeds. And it really depends on kind of what layer and what level you're looking at. And I think we're just now as a society starting to get to see, where we need to pay attention and where we don't, because we've been paying attention to everything and that's just not working. So we're starting to understand that. But I do think that what we can all agree on across all levels is that the exploitation of humans, especially the exploitation of children, regardless of if it's forced labor or commercial sex in nature, is absolutely wrong. And it's the last of the black and white issues, right? The last of the absolute binary issues. You're with us or against us on this issue. And if you're against us, please reach out and let us know. We'll be happy to make you a target.
I'm sure people are curious about the bomb maker. What type of bombs and how did he trick the kids to step on bombs?
So I don't want to get into the details. I'm not really authorized to do that. But what I can say is that the bombs that he was building were triggered by pressure. And it wasn't a matter of tricking. The children just had no idea what was going on. And so he just wanted to make sure that the pressure that a child created wouldn't set off the bomb, but the pressure that you or I would create would.
How does trafficking occur mostly in modern America?
Really in the same way it does in the entire Western world. When we talk about human trafficking holistically across the world, we're predominantly looking at forced labor. But when we start talking about Western societies, we're predominantly talking about commercial sex. Now, when we talk commercial sex trafficking, oftentimes that looks the same as prostitution to the untrained eye. Two very, very different things, right? People who are prostituted are not engaging in that activity through fraud, force, or coercion. Human trafficking victims are being forced into that situation. So while on the surface it might look the same, it's actually very different. And most of this in the Western world happens online. The red light districts of, or in America where in only one county prostitution is legal, throughout the rest of the country, it's illegal. But everybody knew that there was the wrong side of, the wrong side of town that you could go to where you could find, women who were being prostituted, walking what they call the track. You don't see that as much anymore because with the advent and the proliferation of the smartphone and readily accessible, internet right on the phone, people can find what they're looking for within the commercial sex industry right online, which means that this all happens behind closed doors. So it's much more difficult for law enforcement to find.
How young are the girls that these traffickers are grooming and manipulating, and what methods do they employ to gain their confidence?
In the United States, the best statistics that we have come from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is a private nonprofit that works with the government to do very much what we do, just on the child exploitation side. They're specifically focused on missing kids and then a lot on the child pornography issue. Their statistics show that the average age of entry into the human trafficking cycle is 12 to 14 years old. So think about that. A 12 to 14-year-old girl is then manipulated this day and age, often through social media or other internet communication or, internet enabled communication. So we've seen it from gaming consoles and the like. And they're manipulated into thinking that the person on the other end of that communication is going to solve all their problems. So one of the best things that parents can do is make sure that their teenage girls understand that nobody is the solution to all of their problems. And when some boy comes along, some good looking older boy comes along who, has the solution to all their problems, they need to run in the other direction. Now, there are also young boys who are trafficked. We've been involved in a number of those cases. And the youngest that we have seen has been 4 years old. But many of our partners at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children have seen children much younger.
Do you have any individual stories of situations you've encountered whereby you could describe the methods used to keep that person in captivity or manipulate them, how they kept the parents at bay, that kind of thing?
What actually happens is pretty gruesome, and so we probably won't get into that. But there is once the girls are manipulated to the point that they can make physical contact with the trafficker, and then even then the trafficker will continue to manipulate them, and this happens over a period of months to sometimes years. So they bring them into what they call their stable. It's literally what they refer to it as. They bring them into their stable, physically, sexually, emotionally torment them and abuse them in order to just break their spirit. And they immediately get them hooked on narcotics as fast as possible. Usually it's heroin. We have seen cocaine. We have seen Percocet, other types of opiates, but usually it's heroin. And heroin is a business decision, right? It's not the cheapest narcotic. Why aren't they using alcohol or marijuana? Well, because they're not getting the same effect they want. So while they will beat these girls brutally, abuse them brutally, they have to have these girls in good enough condition in order to be able to sell them for an hour. And so they can't have them all black and blue. So what they do is they get them hooked on increasingly high levels of usually heroin. And then if they get out of line, then what they'll do is they'll just withhold the heroin. And the trafficking victims that we've talked to who've been addicted to these high levels of heroin, many of them don't even know how to shoot themselves up. they are completely reliant on the trafficker, or what is called, the bottom girl, which is essentially the trafficker's business manager, completely reliant on them in order to get their heroin fix. So then if they get out of line, the trafficker withholds the heroin. These victims have told us that that it feels like their bones are breaking from inside their body, that they start to hurt so bad from the heroin withdrawals, and they'll get to the point where they will do anything in order to get the heroin. And so that's what the trafficker does. And there's another much, I'm assuming there's not a lot of young children that listen to your podcast. So
no, you're fine. You can say anything you want. You're fine.
Yeah. If there are any parents with young children, this is probably a good time to turn this off. There's another reason that they use heroin. And it's because if the girl gets too out of line and they just need to do away with her, they can give her what they call a hot shot, and they can just OD her on heroin. And then law enforcement shows up to the hotel room and sees what appears to be a prostitute on the floor with a heroin needle hanging out of her arm. And they're like, oh, just another opiate OD, cut and dry, closed case. And now the trafficker doesn't have to worry about law enforcement pursuing a homicide. Because everything appears that this is just a heroin junkie who OD'd.
Good grief, I'm getting a bit speechless here. That's absolutely horrific. Going back to the prevention phase of this, then earlier on, you said about parents looking out for guys approaching girls 12 to 14, for example, offering to solve all their problems. Do these guys pose as boyfriends initially? Is that what you meant?
Yes, absolutely. So really statistically, or not statistically, when you look at the holistic human trafficking problem, really any vulnerable person is vulnerable to being taken advantage of by human traffickers. Now you start adding in lower socioeconomic status. Specifically with girls, you add the lack of a positive male role model. You add, we're in the middle of a COVID pandemic. Some of these kids, the only structure they had was to go to school, and we took that away from them. And then we handed them a laptop and gave them unrestricted access to the internet. So now they're bored sitting around on the internet with all of those other complications. And what happens? They end up coming into contact with traffickers. So you start adding all those complicating factors in, and you end up with vulnerable populations that are being, preyed upon. So for not just parents, but also the friends of other teenage girls to pay attention to what's going on. I know when I was growing up, my friends knew way more about what was happening to me and going on with me in my life than my parents did. And that is definitely the case predominantly with teenage girls. And so for a teenage girl to recognize when one of her friends is being groomed into a trafficking situation is actually the best form of prevention from a general public noticing what's going on. But we believe, and this is really the thesis of our organization, we believe that the ultimate form of prevention for human trafficking is not to have any human traffickers, right? A human trafficker is the common denominator in this equation. And when we remove them, the equation falls apart. You cannot have a trafficking victim if you do not have a human trafficker. And so that is where we spend our time and resources.
So as the girls and boys age in captivity, does there reach a point whereby the traffickers, they're of no further use to the traffickers? And what happens to them at that point?
So yes, that's exactly what happens. At a certain point, there's really three different paths that the trafficking victims will take. Oftentimes you will see them on the side of the road, and they look very much like a washed up person who is being prostituted. Well, if the trafficker just kicks them out of his stable because he doesn't want to deal with them anymore, or he feels like he can replace them with somebody who's going to be more compliant, bring in more money, then they'll just kick them out. That's actually the best of the circumstances. The average rate of survival is 7 years. So usually within a 7-year period, they'll end up dead by any number of means. And then one of the saddest things that happens is you have trafficking victims who start to cooperate with their trafficker in order to get better treatment. They become that trafficker's bottom girl and then transition into becoming a trafficker themselves. And we've seen that happen. I mean, that happens a lot. And that's actually part of the human trafficker's business model.
So has the internet then made all young people vulnerable to this, or do the traffickers particularly target care homes, orphanages, people they feel will have no parents who can call the cops?
Yes. So all young people are vulnerable. All young people with access to the internet and all young people in general are vulnerable to some type of exploitation. You start adding the complicating factors that I was speaking of earlier, and that just increases their vulnerability. So traffickers aren't going to spend a lot of time with low probability resources, right? So great example, there was conspiracy theories going around the internet in the United States about if you found a water bottle on your car, that was a human trafficker who was marking your car as a young lady, so that he knew, which car to watch to come abduct you. Complete, absolute, as you would say, rubbish. Just not true. There was this conspiracy theory going around that a online furniture company was selling children and young girls through their website. Completely not true. Traffickers don't need to go to those kinds of lengths because there are so many vulnerable populations in the world. So runaways, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children estimates that within 48 hours of being a runaway girl will be approached by a human trafficker. You have, like you said, orphanages. Children in the United States at 18 years old, they do what's called aging out of the foster care system. So they'll go from 17 and 364 days old to having a house and people that are responsible for them to at 18 and 1 day old, no longer having a house and anybody who's responsible for them. That's incredibly sad. That just created a very vulnerable person who is now most likely going to be approached by a human trafficker. And you really have to remove the emotion from this and just look at it through a strict academic lens. These human traffickers, this is their business, and they're good at it because they've got a lot of reps at it. And they were trained and mentored by people who were good at it because they had a lot of reps at it. So they know to go hang out at bus stops in the United States and look for what appears to be runaways. They know to hang out outside of community colleges and fast food restaurants. And they know how to target the types of people that they're looking for. And that's just here in the United States, right? And so we start talking about Western countries in general. You might have actually, there's a story from one of our advisors who works with us at DeliverFund, a woman named Tamaya Nagy, and she has a phenomenal book you can buy on our store at deliverfund.org. And her book details how she grew up in Bucharest and applied for a job as a nanny, so she thought, in Toronto. Got to Toronto, they took her passport and immediately abused her and put her in a strip club and made her start dancing. And then kept taking the money, saying that she, it's called debt bondage, saying that she owed them for all the money that they had spent to bring her into Canada. And she knew there was a chance that this could all be for naught, that it could all not be true, but she was willing to take that chance because of the circumstances that she was coming out of in Romania. And you see that in Moldova and Croatia and all over, all over Eastern Europe, all over, impoverished countries, right? South America, Central America, India. And so that's why when you start looking at the strategy for fighting human trafficking, why we're so focused on the human trafficker, because unfortunately, in this day and age, the population of vulnerable people is almost incalculable. So when you start looking at the economics of this, right, the supply of what is the product is unlimited. So you can't really fight human trafficking when the supply of that product is unlimited. The demand, unfortunately, is also unlimited, right? Predominantly male, especially when we start talking about the commercial sex industry. And so it's very important for us as a society to understand, what's connecting the two, the supply to the demand. It's the human trafficker. And so that's what we need to target with as much vigilance as we do anything else.
What procedures or protocol do you have in place to extricate people who are being trafficked? And what success stories do you have?
So the first is, when people hear that our background is military special operations and intelligence agencies, and, we came from kinetic units within those intelligence agencies, immediately they think that we're kicking doors and rogue vigilante justice taking things in their own hands, right? Like it's some kind of Liam Neeson movie. I like to say that, the Taken movies, while entertaining, are not documentaries. We work directly with law enforcement. We like to say that, we were shooters and now we just use computers. We work directly with law enforcement so that those law enforcement officers have the intelligence that they need. Now it's a law enforcement officer that then rescues the victim and then puts them into the system, for victim restoration.
Okay. Have you got actual stories you can tell us about? Didn't you guys get something closed down? What was it called? Backpage
Yes.
or something?
Yes. So we attack the human trafficking system holistically. And one of the most prolific online advertisers globally was a company called Backpage.com. We were one of many different groups involved. Primarily, most of them were law enforcement, but we provided a lot of the intelligence that helped law enforcement figure out how they were laundering their money and what it was they were actually doing. And now if you go to Backpage.com, you'll see a big logo there that says that their website was seized by the Department of Justice. And not only was it seized by the Department of Justice, but we then happened to know that their headquarters was going to be unoccupied. So we actually moved our International Human Trafficking Analysis Center and our headquarters into the old Backpage.com space. And there's many stories we can tell. There's not many that we can tell from the social media perspective, but if people follow us on social media, follow us on YouTube, or go to the DeliverFund.org website, you can find stories of success stories of, in one case, a human trafficking victim literally being pulled out of the trunk of a car by a law enforcement officer. And here we are 5 years later after that. She actually is doing very well and is actually working for us as a consultant now.
What was Backpage actually doing? And what was the story of the 12-year-old who was re-advertised at 18 years old?
Yeah, so Backpage, and this isn't just my opinion anymore. These executives actually pled guilty to this. to a number of charges, but human trafficking was one of them. So what they were doing was when somebody would advertise a minor for sex on their website, they were actually changing that age, and they had some computer programs doing this automatically. Instead of flagging it and bringing it to somebody's attention and saying, "Hey, tell law enforcement about this now," their computer programs were changing the name to 18, or changing the age to 18, so that the ad could go through. So think about the evil there. Now, when it comes to the conversation around persons who are prostituted, or escorts, as we call them, we all know it's actually